Hey, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons and adding expiring powers to your game as a Dungeon Master. Alright, so I'm going to give you an example. I've been using this recently, and I'm going to give you an example of how it's used and how it's done. Alright, so what are expiring powers? They're adding powers to your game that are similar to magic items, but the power it gives to the player expires. It's not permanent. It's just a one-shot, right? Now, it can be extended for all players at your table if it works and if you feel it's safe, right? But this is a great way to test out powers and abilities you want your players to have, or just that you want to bless your players with a little more cool options. Also, this is really perfect to use your dice collection, okay? All right, so let's talk about why I started doing this and how you can do it in your game and the purpose of it. So I have a lot of extra dice, right? And so this is one of the ways is getting my dice into the game, right? Like, I own, I'm not kidding, 40 pairs of dice, right? And like 40 different sets of dice I own. I've been, playing since 1982. I got a lot of dice, right? And some of them are absolutely gorgeous, and most of them are quite unique, right? And so I want to get these dice in the game. Now, recently, what prompted this was I recently picked up a board game which I stripped for parts for Dungeons & Dragons, right? The board game was called Risk Godstorm, right? Now, Risk is a hated game within my family. It takes forever, really long to play, and it all ends in tears and flames at the end, and people are angry with each other. So nobody in my house likes Risk, right? So a buddy of mine, he had bought a lot. He had bought a large collection of board games. There are people who are selling collections nowadays for different reasons. He had bought a large collection of games, and he brought some stuff over. He had priced everything, and all the stuff that was super valuable, he was gonna resell, right? He brought some stuff over and said, like, hey, do you want any of this, right? So I ended up buying Risk Godstorm, which has over 300 miniatures in it, for $7, right? I was like, wow. And so I'm not even going to talk about the miniatures. I'm going to talk about, it had a set of dice in it, 5 black D6s and 5 white D6s. And I'm like, I'm just going to throw this in a box and never use it. You know what, I'm going to use this in my next session. So here's what I did. I wrote on a card. So I took a 3x5 card and I cut it down to the size of a magic card. And then I sleeved it, okay? You don't have to do that. You can just write it on a 3x5 card if you want. But I'm saying that because you don't want to get too crazy with this. You don't want to overthink it and put a whole bunch of rules behind it. So what I did was I wrote down prepared and determined at the top of the card. And then I wrote 5 black D6s, 5 white D6s, spend and return. All white D6s can be used on D20 rolls. All black D6s can be used on non-D20 rolls. That's it. So it can be used by anybody, any player, right? Doesn't matter what their heritage is. Doesn't matter what their background is. Doesn't matter what class they are, right? And the way I did this was, as soon as we had any kind of downtime, and you could literally have an NPC walk right into them and get into this. If an NPC just spends 2 hours with them, right? Like, visiting them at their campsite, you could be done with as little NPC time as that. But if they go into any kind of village, or if they go into any city, you can have, so if their character, what I did in my game is I have a fighter, and there's a fighter who was in town, who was visiting his parents before he left, right? And so the fighter NPC comes up to the fighter PC and is like, hey, I need to spar. Can we spar? Right? So so basically they, both grab some sticks and just start, whacking at each other, subdual damage. But the guy goes hard at him, right? Like, and actually I took the subdual damage off the fighter and said, the two of you spar, and you're just, you are just helping this guy keep fit as he's just, as he's in town, right? And I said at some point, I said, okay, so you guys are sparring, and then the fighter NPC says to you, hey, your upward thrust is all wrong. You're coming forward and you're using 2 hands. You should be letting go and making your upward thrust with one hand, and then you throw your other hand back and push forward your hip, right? Like, it gives them advice on how to make a proper sword cut. And I said, do you ignore what he's saying and give him guff and say, who do you train me? Or do you say, show me what you mean, right? And then you practice it a bit. And the player says, I want to learn, show me what you mean. So as soon as I'm done, I said, okay, the two of you spar for 3 hours. And then as soon as that encounter is done, I handed the player the card that says, 5 black D6s, 5 white D6s, spend and return. You are prepared and determined. Right? And the player's like, well, what is this? And I'm like, every single one of those white D6s, you can add them anytime you want to a D20 roll, before or after. But when you use it, you roll it, and then it comes back to me. Right? And they're like, well, how do I get them back? And I'm like, you don't. Right? Like, this, you from having done this practice with this NPC, you are now prepared and determined. Right? And the reason why is this NPC understood your style, and you were willing to learn from them. Right? And the fighter's like, woo, and the fighter used I was like, I said, hey, and so basically, and I didn't have to say anything more. The fighter used all the dice, got extra damage, got extra, got hits, right? Actually didn't use them all on a roll. I didn't put that caveat. Oh, you can throw them, you can just throw 5, D6s onto one roll. If they want to do that, it's okay, right? Now, was this balanced? No, right? And the reality is, I'm very blessed to have players who are not trying to break the game, so it really wasn't even a balance issue with my players. But let's say you have the worst players in the world, right? And they want to break your game. It still doesn't matter, right? Because once the last dice is used, the card comes back, and they're no longer prepared and determined, right? So you can build custom fit powers, add them right into your game, and use all kinds of crazy little bits and tokens that you have, and basically you can add them right into the game and say, use it and lose it, right? So basically, once they've used it, it comes back, right? And to you, and it's done. And if you want them to have it permanently, you just bake it into a magic item. And you could try it out for a few sessions until you see it, and then that same functionality could show up in a ring or in a cape or in boots or anything like that. So this is how you use expiring powers in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. That's how I do it. How do you do it? What do you do to use your extra little bits and pieces and tokens in your Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game? I'd love to learn it. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.